Hi, and welcome to today's class on gas exchange and respiratory systems. Last class we learned about the cardiovascular system, and at that time I mentioned the fact that the cardiovascular system is intimately linked with several other organ systems in the body, including, for example, the digestive system for picking up and carrying nutrients around the body. But I also mentioned that the cardiovascular system was very intimately linked with the respiratory system. In fact, one of the two places that blood is generally moved from the heart is into and through the lungs in the pulmonary circuit. So today we're going to look at respiratory systems, again, because they work so closely with the cardiovascular system. I want you to remember, if you can, what you learned last class about circulation and blood flow as it pertains to the pulmonary circuit. I also wanted to tell you a little bit today about why respiratory systems actually exist. In fact, it's often pointed out to me by students that it can be confusing when we talk about respiration because respiration in the context that we're using today refers to the process of physical respiration, physically moving air in and out of our lungs and exchanging carbon dioxide and oxygen with blood. But there's also cellular respiration, which we learned about back in first semester. So the term respiration is used in both cases, and so therefore it's confusing. But fortunately, as I'll point out in a few minutes, there's a reason for this confusion because the two systems are actually linked. What's happening at the cellular level necessitates a physiological system. And also I think today I'll talk a little bit about the basic anatomy, the structures of our respiratory system or physiological respiratory system. If you would like, there's also a YouTube video link down here at the bottom of this slide, and this references a crash course video on respiration and gas exchange. It's probably worth watching. You might also perhaps note that our textbook is relatively light in terms of its coverage of anatomy and physiology. Anytime I've referenced some pages to read in the textbook, if you wanted extra information or some extra review, it's usually only been 2 to 3 pages as opposed to all or part of a chapter. Our textbook is relatively light in terms of human anatomy and physiology. And so I'm going to try and make this PowerPoint as simple but still comprehensive as possible, but also reference you to the crash course videos, which do a really good job also of covering the same information. Now today's Would You Rather deals a little bit with respiration. And so the Would You Rather for today is, would you rather have external gills in addition to your lungs, or would you like to be able to breathe through your skin in addition to your lungs? I don't know if there's a right answer or even a best or good answer here, but I suspect if it were me, my personal preference would be to have external gills. Okay, so let's take it all the way down to the level of the cell. And in fact, let's sort of ignore, just for the next few minutes, human anatomy and physiology. Let's simply consider before, say, animals evolved, in fact, even before plants and protists and fungi, all of those things evolved. Let's really take it back about, say, 3 billion or maybe 2 billion years ago, when the first eukaryotic cells first arose on Earth. Now, if you consider a single happy eukaryotic cell doing its thing, living out its eukaryotic existence, there are some basic needs that any eukaryotic cell has. I think if you thought about it for a minute, you could probably come up with a few. A eukaryotic cell probably should be bathed in water, so it should have a need to maintain osmotic balance or water across its cell membrane. It may need to move in and out certain materials that it accumulate inside it or that are found outside it that it would like to take in. And it certainly is starting, if it's a living, thriving cell, it's starting to do some sort of probably cellular metabolism and therefore creating waste products inside the cell. And so there's a need to move waste products from the inside out. And of course, if it's doing cellular respiration, it needs certain gases to perform cellular respiration in addition to glucose. So there's a lot going on with this little eukaryotic cell. And yet this simple eukaryotic cell is able to meet most of its cellular needs and demands simply through passive diffusion. Now, we talked about passive diffusion way back in first semester, and I hope that you'll recall that diffusion is simply the movement of a molecule from an area, or molecules from an area of high to low concentration. So, for example, if you recall the chemical formula for, in this case, cellular respiration, where glucose together with oxygen is broken down into carbon dioxide, water, and eventually the energy used to create ATP. Because the cell is performing cellular respiration, it obviously needs glucose. And as long as glucose is in its environment, glucose can diffuse into the cell. But it also needs oxygen, and it also accumulates toxic carbon dioxide. Now, again, this cell, as long as its surface area to volume ratio is suitable, is able to rely on simple passive diffusion to get rid of and accumulate the reactants and products it needs for cellular respiration. So, for example, if there is a higher concentration of oxygen outside the cell, particularly as our cell is consuming it on the inside, diffusion will just continue to move that oxygen down its concentration gradient into the cell. Equally, as the cell is going through cellular respiration and producing carbon dioxide waste, levels of carbon dioxide will increase in the cell, be greater than the levels outside, and of course, passive diffusion will simply allow the substances like carbon dioxide to move out. This is all well and good, ladies and gentlemen, if this is a single, simple cell. As long as it has the right surface area to volume ratio and doesn't try to get too big, a single cell doesn't need any sort of sophisticated organ systems to help it with its respiratory needs. So that changes, though, if you start to make more complicated things like fungi or protists or animals, right? Because one of the defining characteristics of the kingdom Animalia is, in fact, first of all, that we're heterotrophs, but second of all, that we are multicellular. We have more than one cell, typically millions, billions, or trillions of cells. The more cells that we add, ladies and gentlemen, the more difficult it becomes to get gases like oxygen into cells on the inside of the organism and to move waste products out. Now, if you are a simple organism, and by simple I mean flat and relatively small, you may still be able to get by through simple gas exchange across the body wall. So here we have a planaria, or that's, for example, platyhelminthes. Tapeworms don't have sophisticated respiratory systems because they're very long and very flat, and so much so that gas exchange is able to move gases in and out simply by diffusion because they are so wide and flat. That said, that limits to some extent how large an animal like a tapeworm or a planarian can actually get, right? Because if you're relying on diffusion to move gases in and out, and you're super flat, allowing that to happen, if you start to get bigger, rounder, fatter, and taller, you're no longer flat, and now you start having issues of getting gases inside and out of the organism. So the solution then is, if you want to make a bigger, badder organism, right, that's multicellular and big, is to put a system of, or a network of tubes or sacs inside of the organism so the gases can be pulled into the central cavity. It's a little bit like if you have an apartment building and you need to get air circulating through it, you have an HVAC system, right? This is maybe synonymous with our lungs and bronchioles and trachea, but you have the system, a network of ducts that lead all the way through and feed every building or every room in the building with enough air or enough airflow. So the solution then is, if you're going to make an organism that's bigger and not as flat as a tapeworm is that you probably need to have some way of moving gases into the center of the organism. And certainly ducts is one, not D-U-C-K, but D-U-C-T, ducts, and something synonymous to an HVAC system is one way to accomplish this. If you consider something like a sponge, they don't actually have ducts that run, or a system of tubes. They just simply have one big, large central cavity, and water actually passes through, well, I guess it sort of does have ducts. It passes through these passages to the inner part, bathing them with water. The outer cells are exposed to water where there's oxygen, dissolved oxygen, and gas exchange is able to happen. But of course, it would be inconvenient for large terrestrial animals to have one huge big hole in their body like this. It may provide an opportunity for gases to reach the inner lining of cells, and maybe their outer lining of cells would also be exposed to the air. But basically, you're going to have one big, large, cavernous organism that is limited because it can only, if it only has a central cavity or central pouch, it can't get more complicated and attach arms and legs and things to it. I'm maybe getting a little bit off topic or digressing a little bit, but the central cavity works well for sponges, and it works well for organisms like cnidarians or jellyfish, but it takes up an awful lot of space. I don't know exactly what's going on with this particular sponge. It apparently is breathing, but this sponge to your left definitely doesn't have the lungs that this sponge to your right does. So a solution then would be to put a large central pouch or series of pouches, right? So imagine a very primitive respiratory system in an organism like the Homer Simpson here, and then we draw air into them. Then we do have a sort of solution to the problem of getting gases into the center of an organism. So as Homer inhales and these bags inflate, then the respiratory surfaces on the inside are able to do gas exchange. But it only goes so far. This is, well, first of all, let's talk about the problem of the amount of air that you're actually able to breathe in. If you simply had lungs that were two simple balloons, you could draw in a lot of air into each of those two balloons and draw then a large amount of gas into the center of the body. But if you want to make it even more efficient, you could take those balloons and subdivide them, make them smaller balloons, so that within that same volume, you're increasing the surface area. Remember, if we see folds in biology, that's an indication that we're trying to improve the surface area. And moreover, you could feed all of those smaller sacs within the bigger sac with branched tubes. So in fact, we do see branched tubes like this. We have central trachea, then it splits into two bronchi and bronchioles and smaller and smaller and smaller tubes. But what is most efficient in terms of surface area would be, instead of having, a couple of large sacs or even a couple of, smaller sacs within them, if we just ended these small branches with lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of really teeny tiny balloons. So what we have then is the same overall volume as these lungs, right? The same overall volume, but way, 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 way more surface area because we have so many little teeny tiny folds on the inside of our lungs. And we'll talk more about the anatomy of the lungs in a minute, but in fact, the surface area of the lungs is rather large when you, if you're able to take all those little tiny sacs and unfold them and flatten them. I think the statistic is something like you have enough surface area in your lungs if you flatten it all out to cover a tennis court. So the reason, of course, we don't have tennis court sized chests is because we basically take all that surface area and then put it in a little smaller, little teeny tiny sacs. Another feature of respiratory surfaces is that they need to be constantly kept moist. The first respiratory surfaces were in things like fish, the first vertebrates. with respiratory surfaces, and they had gills. Well, gills, of course, are always in contact with water. But as animals made a transition to land, if you think about amphibians, they did develop lungs, but they also have moist surfaces on their skin, which also act as respiratory surfaces. Those surfaces have to be kept moist constantly. But then even the lungs themselves need to have a moist surface. The simple reason is that as air is brought into the lungs, in order to get it into the body, it has to dissolve into water, then into the blood, then to be carried around the entire body. And so the respiratory surface itself has to be moist or wet in order for air that's moved into it to dissolve and then pass across the cell membranes and into the bloodstream. So yes, the inner part of your lungs are in fact very moist and wet, so much so that we potentially have problems with the very, very small tubes and the alveoli, these small surfaces that I mentioned in the last slide. They're so small and so wet that every time you inhale and exhale, we risk those little bubbles, those little balloons, those little alveoli sticking together because of cohesion and adhesion of water. So our lungs actually produce a sort of a slippery substance called a surfactant to prevent that from happening. It's kind of a tangent. It's neither here nor there, but you do need to know or understand that respiratory surfaces, like the inside of our lungs, have to be kept constantly moist in order for respiration to occur. So let's take a look quickly at the structures of the respiratory system. Some of these structures are fairly familiar to you. Of course, we have our nose and mouth, so we breathe in through both of these. They're connected in the back of the throat at the pharynx. And remember from our last unit on digestion that air constantly moves down our throats, and if the epiglottis is relaxed, that opens up our trachea and allows air to enter the lungs. The trachea, of course, is this big, long tube that's lying in front of the esophagus behind it. It's also called your air pipe, but let's call it the trachea. And these little rings are rings of cartilage that constantly hold the trachea open. So it's like a vacuum cleaner hose. The trachea then, as you breathe in through your mouth and nose, the air goes down your pharynx, down into your trachea, and then it splits. We have two lungs on either side. So the trachea splits, right? Our vacuum cleaner hose splits in two, kind of like blood vessels splitting as they get smaller and smaller. And at this point, we call them bronchioles. The bronchioles continue to split more and more and more. And again, as I showed you on this slide, eventually those bronchioles end in little dead-ended air sacs called alveoli, the little teeny tiny sacs. And here are all the alveoli at the end of the smallest bronchi. So the bronchioles split, they become even smaller, they're called bronchi. And then the bronchi wind up ending in these little small inflatable sacs called the alveoli. And the alveoli are constantly sort of expanding and closing every time we inhale and exhale. You should be relatively familiar with the basic anatomy. And we're going to come back to the alveoli. This is where all the interesting stuff in respiration happens, is in the alveoli. And make note of this, there are blood vessels that run across the alveoli. And here's our connection to our circulatory systems. We'll get to this in a couple of minutes. A quick note on how breathing works, because it's maybe not at all obvious. I mean, everybody breathes, and even if you stop and think about breathing, you can will yourself to breathe. But anatomically, what's happening is fairly interesting. We basically have these, again, balloons inside of our thoracic cavity that we have to inflate and deflate with air. Now, to accomplish this, we actually have a big band of muscle that actually lies below the lungs and above the abdominal wall, above all of the abdomen. All of the digestive organs are down in here. And if you ever do a dissection like a fetal pig or a rat or something like that, you would actually be able to see where the digestive system and the abdominal cavity ends and where the thoracic cavity begins, and vice versa. There's this big thick wall of muscle. Well, in order to inhale, the diaphragm needs to actually contract and move downward. So imagine, if you can, just grabbing the diaphragm in this picture and pulling it down, right? And as you do that, you're actually going to create in the lungs an area of negative pressure. So let's say the diaphragm is relaxed. It's sort of in this curved shape here, and your lungs are at equilibrium with the air pressure in the room right now. If your diaphragm moves down, and in fact, we also have muscles in between our ribs called intercostal muscles, and if those also contract and pull the ribs out, and the diaphragm moves down, we're basically now creating negative pressure in the thoracic cavity, and air will rush in through our nose and throats, or our mouths, nose, down into our throats. So again, you pull down on the diaphragm, you contract the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, they expand and move downward. You basically create negative pressure in the thoracic cavity, and air moves in. Now, to exhale, you relax all of those muscles. The intercostals relax, and the ribs actually move down with the force of gravity. They're actually sort of pulled apart by the intercostals. When you relax them, the ribs contract back down to their normal shape. The diaphragm relaxes and moves up, and we now create negative pressure in our thoracic cavity, and air moves up. There's a whole lot of physics going on there, and I don't want to get too super involved with it, but you should basically understand that breathing is actually a process that requires energy and work. We actually have to contract the diaphragm. We have to contract these muscles around our ribs. We have to expand the chest cavity so that air moves in, and then we relax those things. The chest cavity goes back down to its sort of normal size, creating positive air pressure, and then air is exhaled out. Hopefully this week in our lab, we'll be able to determine what's called the vital capacity. That's the maximum volume of air that you can inhale and exhale. For most of us, that's between 3 and 5 liters. So imagine a liter of milk or a liter of Coke. If you imagine taking the biggest breath you can, inhaling it in, and then exhaling until you get every last little bit of air out of your lungs, which, by the way, is not actually every last little bit. Even when you try and force as much air as you can out of your lungs, there's always still a little bit of residual air left in there. You can't completely collapse your lungs. But if you imagine doing that, your biggest, and then your biggest exhale, and you exhale as long as you can and push every last little bit of air out, that would be your vital capacity. And for somebody with large lungs, it might be between 5 and 6. Somebody who has smaller lungs, it might be as small as 3 or maybe a little bit less liters. And lots of things can affect that. Your vital capacity gets a little bit smaller as you get older. Obviously, bigger people have a larger vital capacity. People who are more physically fit and train their lungs to hold more air can do that. Typically, but not always, males have generally large or bigger vital capacities. And of course, respiratory diseases, things like emphysema, can reduce your vital capacity. And I hope in lab this week we're going to measure that. Okay, really big scary picture here, but I just want to quickly kind of tie all of this together and explain how breathing actually works in terms of gas exchange. This is a big photograph that shows the smallest bronchi, the smallest tubes in the lungs. Here are those alveoli, those little tiny inflatable sacs. And what I want you to notice is that there's a whole network of blood vessels which wrap around every single alveolus. And that is actually intentional. So if you follow this blood vessel here, you can see that the red, which actually, if it's red, it's probably indicating oxygenated. So the blood is actually deoxygenated. It's probably coming down here. Deoxygenated blood from the heart is moving down this blood vessel. And when it gets to this alveolus, it has smaller and smaller capillaries which pass over the alveolus, like right here. And now here is where gas exchange is actually happening. Here, the blood is giving up its carbon dioxide and picking up oxygen. It continues along this capillary, oxygenating as it goes. let's actually follow it here. It's maybe a little easier to see. Comes down here, oxygenates, and then now the blood is fully oxygenated. It moves away from the from the alveoli and the bronchi. It moves up this capillary and up this small vein, and then moves further along up the bronchi and back towards the heart. So now the oxygenated blood can be circulated. So again, all the magic happens right here at the level of the alveoli. And again, deoxygenated blood is passed over the alveoli. Oxygen-rich air that you breathe in allows oxygen to diffuse into the blood. The carbon dioxide diffuses into the alveoli where it's exhaled out. Now the oxygenated blood moves back out and back to the heart for the systemic circulation. So here's basically, again, how this looks. Airflow moves air into the alveoli. Here is deoxygenated blood, or blood which is low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide. And as it passes over the alveoli, carbon dioxide diffuses into the alveoli, oxygen replaces it, it diffuses into the blood, and then as the blood flows back past the alveoli, it is now oxygenated and it's lost its carbon dioxide. Now, the reason that this actually happens, without getting into too much detail, is that it's simple diffusion and simple concentration gradients. So just bear with me. Honestly, this is just a 1 to 2 minute little explanation. If blood which reaches the lungs is high in carbon dioxide, and you just have inhaled air which is low in carbon dioxide, then we have created a condition where there is a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood and low concentration in the alveoli. And because of that, it is simple diffusion. High concentrations of carbon dioxide will diffuse to where there's less carbon dioxide, so it is out of the blood. The blood keeps passing across the alveoli, and at the same time, it has a low concentration of oxygen, but you just took a big breath of air, which is high in oxygen. So that air, which is rich in oxygen, reaches the alveoli, and now it simply diffuses from the alveoli into the blood because there's a concentration gradient there. So again, it's all simple chemistry. It's all diffusion. It's all stuff that we learned way back in the first semester. When you breathe in and you have lots of oxygen in the air you breathe, it will be diffused, or it diffuses into the blood because there is a lower concentration of oxygen in the blood when it first reaches the lungs. Equally, the blood, because it's returned from around the body where it's picked all that carbon dioxide up, it passes through the lungs, and now there's a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood, and it simply diffuses into the alveoli, and then when you breathe out, all of that carbon dioxide leaves the body. That, my friends, is about all that you need to know for physiological respiration. There's a connection to cellular respiration. Let me go back one slide. All the carbon dioxide that you're breathing out that's been picked up by the blood is coming from cellular respiration. So one final quick connection here. Imagine some cells in your big toe. Those cells have gone through cellular respiration. As blood reaches the cells in the big toe, carbon dioxide will diffuse into the blood. Remember, the carbon dioxide is coming from the cells performing cellular respiration. So they diffuse carbon dioxide into the blood, and oxygen diffuses into the cells of your big toe to replace the oxygen which was consumed by cellular respiration. The blood, now rich in carbon dioxide, will return to the heart and then to the lungs. The blood now passes by the alveoli, and all that carbon dioxide that came from those cells in your big toe, all that carbon dioxide diffuses into your alveoli, out the alveoli into the bronchi, to the bronchioles, to the trachea, to your nose, and out your mouth. So basically, every time you exhale, you are breathing out carbon dioxide that came from cellular respiration in the cells in your body. lots of connections to lots of systems in biology. If you want to read the last few slides of this PowerPoint presentation, they ask about different kinds of adaptations for respiration. There's some tapeworms. How do they do respiration? Deep sea hagfish have really, really low metabolic rates. Why would that be a respiratory adaptation? Talk a little bit about that surfactant, that layer that because they're constantly moist. It turns out bacterial pneumonia will actually affect that surfactant, so it's no longer produced or no longer effective. So how would that affect breathing? There's an interesting question about the beta splendans is the Siamese fighting fish. They live in water which is really tepid and low in oxygen. So they actually have an organ above their mouth that allows them to gulp air and hold it in. How would that be an adaptation to the environment that they live in? And then here's an interesting thing about whales. Whales that feed at deep, they maybe go down 1,000 meters or more and hold their breath for 20 to 30 minutes. All the while their cells are doing respiration and producing carbon dioxide. How is it that they're able to hold their breath that long and not suffocate? And in fact, they, not only that, but they actually exhale. They collapse their lungs and breathe out before they do a deep dive. Why would they want to do that? So you can think about those adaptations. It's kind of sort of interesting thought experiments, but beyond that, I'm not going to ask you to do any more with the respiratory system until our lab next class. Thank you so much for your attention. I know it's been a long lecture, but if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.